Welcome back to the Whole Bible series. This week we are in the book of Daniel. Daniel is part of the writings in the Tanakh. In our Bible, Daniel is part of the Old Testament prophets. The purpose of the book of Daniel concerns the sovereignty of God. As Daniel and his friends trust the Lord, God shows himself able to protect and deliver. Daniel's visions proclaim God's sovereignty over kings, nations, and empires. At the same time, his prophecies tell the people of Israel that the kingdom they were waiting for would be longer in coming than expected. In the meantime, they were to live out their faith in the midst of an unbelieving world, trusting God for deliverance and protection. For more information, go back to episode 27. Daniel is the 27th book of the Bible and the last book of the major prophets. Who wrote Daniel and when? Both Hebrew and Christian tradition hold that Daniel was written by the prophet Daniel. The book includes both first-person and third-person accounts, so it may have been edited at a later date, compiling additional information. The events of the book are roughly dated from 605 BC to 536 BC. The final composition of the book must be dated sometime thereafter. Some scholars argue against a 6th century date and against Daniel's authorship. Their argument is that some of the events prophesied by Daniel were fulfilled in the 2nd century BC, and that the book resembles other intertestamental apocalypse literatures which were written anonymously. However, this view denies predictive prophecy. Also, if the work were completed in the 160s BC as claimed, there would not have been enough time to copy and spread the work throughout the ancient Near East for acceptance and canonization to occur prior to the writing of the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So note here from the survey of the Old Testament on the left. The result of all of this is that we see no evidence to preclude dating the book to the 6th century BC. Furthermore, the linguistic evidence in regard to both the Hebrew and the Aramaic of Daniel points to a time earlier than the 2nd century, as does the appearance of Daniel in the Septuagint, which is dated as early as the 3rd century BC, and the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st to the 2nd centuries BC. Again, for more information, go back to episode 27. Themes in Daniel are the sovereignty of God, the kingdom of God, and pride and rebellion. In Daniel, the prophecy versus eschatology. There's a note here from the survey of the Old Testament that the kingdom of God is the climax of God's agenda for Israel and the world is communicated very clearly in the book of Daniel. The concept is introduced in chapter 2 as a kingdom that will never be destroyed, though in some sentences, God already rules an everlasting kingdom. In 7, 9 through 14, little additional information is given except in the introduction of one referred to as the Son of Man, to whom the kingdom of God was given. There's no doubt that the Son of Man was recognized as a messianic figure. Chapters 9 and 11 are primarily concerned with the time of the end, and that is to precede the setting up of the kingdom of God. For these reasons, we give the book of Daniel an eschatology rating of 3 out of 4 horsemen. The book of Daniel is broken into 3 sections. Here's Daniel on the timeline. So you'll see the little dark blue circle at the bottom. And it's down here because he is in the area of Mesopotamia for most of this time, or at least his prophetic time. And so he roughly fits into the time frame of most of the exile. Here's Daniel in context with the kings of Judah. So he was probably born during the time of Josiah and then lived through the end of the kingdom of Judah. Let's move on to section 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, 607 BC approximately, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So again, this happens approximately 607 BC. We remember that Jerusalem was not destroyed until 586 BC, but there were some that were exiled before that time. So it's similar to what we saw last week with Ezekiel. Daniel comes into the same happening. He gets exiled much earlier than the fall of Jerusalem itself. So here's a reminder from 2 Kings 24. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against it. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans and bands of the Syrians and bands of the Moabites and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants and prophets. So Jehoiakim slept with his father, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. Verse 5. The king assigned them, referring to going back, let's go back to verse 4, or verse 3, the royal family and the nobility that was taken off to Babylon. The king assigned them a daily portion of food. That was what the king ate, and the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear the Lord my king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than any of the youths who are your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Let's pause there. So here Daniel's asking for vegetables and water. Often this gets misconstrued that Daniel is a vegetarian. Even recently, there's been a vegetarian diet that's come out called, I don't remember the name of it, but it's Daniel's vegetarian diet, referring back to this story in the Old Testament. But was Daniel actually a vegetarian? Let's look at what the Bible Knowledge Commentary says. This food, the food that was offered to them, did not conform to the requirements of Mosaic law. The fact that it was prepared by Gentiles rendered it unclean. Also, no doubt, many things forbidden by the law were served on the king's table. So to partake of such food would defile the Jewish youths. Further, without doubt, this royal food had been sacrificed and offered to pagan gods before it was offered to the king. To partake of such food would be contrary to Exodus 34:15, where the Jews were forbidden to eat flesh sacrificed to pagan gods. Further, later in the book, the story actually insinuates that Daniel takes a break from eating meat to go on another vegetarian fast or diet. So this does not make Daniel a vegetarian. However, he is trying to honor God in this point. And so he asked to be given only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Verse 13. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in his visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among them was none found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, here we were referring to Cyrus II. You see here from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, also known as Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, circa 559 through 529 BC. Cyrus became Lord of Judah when he conquered Babylon, which had been ruling Judah in 539 BC. Let's move on to section 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that all the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word is from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you were to show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all of the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So let's just jump and look at the timeline real quick. So we see in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, how can we make that work with the information that we already have? Well, let's look over here to the timeline on the left. So Nebuchadnezzar and his armies continued sacking nations after they conquered Jerusalem. So they conquered Jerusalem, they sent the Judahites to Babylon, and they continued conquering other nations. In fact, they defeated Egypt in 605 BC. This allows for Nebuchadnezzar to finally sit rested on the throne by 605 BC and gives time for Daniel's 3 years of training prior to the incident in 2:1. So in this timeline, Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem. They exile the Judahites to Babylon, and he goes on and conquers Egypt in 605 BC. He then comes back and sits on the throne, and in his second year of his reign in Susa, or in Babylon, wherever he is sitting at that time, Daniel has now finished his training and is counted among the wise men. Verse 13. So a decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation of the king, or to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He went in and said thus before him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I shall show the king the interpretation. Just note here on the left, if you remember back to the story of Esther, one must be invited into the presence of the king. You cannot just walk in to see the king in his chambers. For failure to do so, failure to get permission in or being invited into the king's throne room could result as a death sentence. Let's look to verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and thus said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay there on your bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, the mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. Its head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. We'll pause real quick. Here we see the areas highlighted in red. Daniel is making known the greatness of Yahweh. Or I should say, Yahweh is making himself known, his own greatness known to Nebuchadnezzar. Just as Yahweh used Joseph and Moses in Egypt to prove that he is superior to the Egyptian gods, here he also proves his preeminence over the Babylonian or Chaldean gods. Verse 34. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like a chaff on the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away, and so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king of its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay, so they will mix together one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that the stone was cut from the mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and a great many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So let's go back to the part written in red. And if you notice that there is a worldwide mountain kingdom. So let's look at what that means. In the ancient Near East, mountains are seen as theological concepts. Many nations have gods who dwell on mountains. Mountains have a quite positive value in the biblical tradition. Yahweh is God of the mountains. The Bible contains a tradition of the mountain as a holy place. This comes from Dictionary of Demons and Deities, or I should say Deities and Demons. Let's look a little bit more at this Edenic mountain motif. The Garden of Eden, of course, is a lush, well-watered habitation. Ezekiel 28:13 mentions the Garden of Eden, Garden of God, but then adds the description that the Garden of God is God's holy mountain. We naturally think of God's mountain as Sinai or Mount Zion. When it comes to a garden imagery, the latter is spoken of in Edenic terms. Like Eden, Mount Zion is described as a water habitation. Whether Sinai or Zion, the mountain of God, in effect, his temple. All right, let's pause there real quick. That comes from Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm. So if you think of the original Eden, if this is the place where God dwells in this garden amongst the humans that he created, it is very well known to the ancient peoples that this would have been a mountain. And so Eden and mountain, those things go together. And so that's where we get the Edenic mountain motif beginning, is from the pages of the Old Testament and the ideas of gods living on mountains. Let's see what Daniel 2:35 says. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So not only did the stone that broke the kingdoms become a great mountain, a kingdom in itself, but it filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar's dream shows of the coming of a stone, not cut by human hands, coming to overthrow the reigning kingdoms of the earth. God will then turn the stone into a mountain that will cover the whole earth. In essence, God is remaking the entire earth into a new Eden, his own kingdom where he will dwell on his holy mountain. Let's look at Daniel's other experiences. We have the story of Nebuchadnezzar's great statue. You probably know this as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. There is a story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a toppled tree. Here, Yahweh uses Daniel to humble Nebuchadnezzar. We have a story of Belshazzar's feast. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's son, the king that takes over. So not Belteshazzar, which is Daniel's name, but Belshazzar. Daniel remembered, and Belshazzar killed, happens in chapter 5. And then we get to the story of Daniel and the lion's den, which I'm sure you all know. And here, King Darius must acknowledge the power of Yahweh. And on to the third and final section. So in the third and final section, we have Daniel's apocalyptic visions. The chapter 7, we have the vision of the 4 beasts in the heavenly court. In here, we have the Ancient of Days judging the beasts. We also have the Son of Man being given. Let's look at Daniel 7:13-14. Daniel says this: I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. So if we go back to our last section where we talk about God's mountain that covers the earth, here we now have not only the Edenic kingdom covering the entire earth, but we are now given a son of man to rule it, to have dominion over it, and live in a kingdom that will not pass away. The phrase, the Son of Man, we talked a little bit about this last week. Son of Man is found 93 times in Ezekiel and refers to the prophet's humanity. Poetic parallelisms in the Old Testament also use Son of Man in this sense, always in the second half of the parallelism. A divine apocalyptic figure known as the Son of Man appears in 1st Enoch and 4th Ezra, or 4th Ezra. You would know it as 4th Ezra, or also Esdras. So here we see that also in Daniel, that the title Son of Man is placed on a messianic figure. Then we come to chapter 8, the vision of the ram, the goat, and the little horn. Chapter 9 is Daniel's prayer and its answer. And then finally closing the book, Daniel has a vision of the final conflict. So that's the end of the book of Daniel. So Daniel lives through most of the exile and lives to see the first wave of Jews return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in the time of Darius. All right, and let's look at the ending of Daniel's story. So again, here we don't have any biblical information on Daniel's end of life or his death, but Jewish tradition of Daniel's life is included again in the pseudepigraphic book, The Lives of the Prophets. And his death is only recorded by church tradition and in the 13th century book, the Book of the Bee. With Daniel, we don't have a lot of information, but I'll read you here what comes out of these two books. Out of the Lives of Prophets, Daniel was from Jerusalem, of the tribe of Judah, and his father's name was Hananiah. For Hananiah and Jehoiakim were sons of King Josiah. And Jehoiakim begat Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, and Hananiah, his brother, begat Daniel. Let's pause real quick, because this is obviously a little confusing. All right, so here, the Lives of the Prophets is claiming that Daniel comes from royal lineage. So we all know that Jehoiakim comes from Josiah because he's the king that comes after Josiah. Here, it also claims that Daniel's father, Hananiah, was also born of King Josiah. So this must be the younger brother to Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim has 3 sons, and he names them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Well, you'll recognize the names Mishael and Azariah because that's who becomes Meshach and Abednego. All right, so let's continue. So there's a Hananiah who is the brother of Jehoiakim, and there's also a Hananiah that is the son of Jehoiakim. All right, so Daniel is fathered by Jehoiakim's brother. And when they were youths, they went to Babylon as hostages. And Daniel was chaste and fasting and thin in his body, and he kept himself apart from the food until his cheeks dried up. And it is though that he was a eunuch. Oh, excuse me, that should be thought. I apologize. And it is thought that he was a eunuch. And on this account, he was entrusted with the king's bedchamber. Real quick, just a little commentary on that. If you don't know what eunuchs are, please look it up. This is somebody that is able to serve the king because they cannot have sexual relations. They can no longer copulate because they're missing certain parts of their body. And because these eunuchs are missing certain parts of their body, they're given responsibilities within the king bedchamber and dealing with the king's wives and his concubines and all that kind of stuff. And because they're eunuchs, obviously they can't defile the king's wives and his concubines. So he's saying here that Daniel was assumed to be a eunuch, and because of that, he was entrusted with the king's bedchamber. But he remained after the people 6 years in Babylon and was buried in the royal cave with splendor and great honor. But others say that it was in the city of Elam that Daniel died and was buried in Shushan, the palace. Let's look to the book of the Bee. Daniel of the tribe of Judah and was born in Upper Beth Horon. He was a man who kept himself from women, and hence the Jews thought that he was a eunuch, for his face was different and he had no children. He prayed for the Babylonians and died in Elam in the city of Hosea and was buried in Shoshan, the fortress. So these are similar endings there. And from what it seems, it looks like Daniel was not martyred, unlike most of the other prophets. And this is all the information we have. It seems to line up a little bit there at the end, at least where he could possibly have been buried. So that's the end of the book. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Please post down below. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.